Very warm welcome to you, quite literally. I'm very heartened that this sultry weather has not persuaded any of you to not come to this event, and also to keep your clothes on too. I recently listened to a lecture by the Dutch architect Ole Archis, and he started by very dramatically throwing down his jacket onto the stage, like a toreador. But I don't think I'm going to follow his cue. Being a more formal English person, I will keep my clothes on for the time being. Welcome to the symposium. Is there a Dutchness in the state of architecture? My name is Lucy Bullivant, and I'm chairing this provocatively titled discussion this evening, which I'm pleased to say is a cross-cultural collaboration. The event has been organized independently from the AA, but is nonetheless an initiative that embraces the liberal ethos that it has always strived to embody and engender. Before I briefly explain some of the triggering factors behind the theme chosen, and introduce the first speaker, I want to thank Mohsen Mostafavi most warmly for his enthusiasm and support for this project, and to extend my gratitude to the joint publishers of Archis magazine, the Netherlands Architecture Institute, and Elsevier, the publishers involved, and also to the Royal Netherlands Embassy here in London for kindly providing the funds to make this event possible. Such support for ventures in this kind in the UK is conspicuous by its scarcity and hopefully enables the public meeting of minds to remind you how much London enjoys and relies upon its international talk-in culture. After the symposium, we are serving some necessary post-event lubrication upstairs in the bar in the form of drinks in the front members' room next to the bar. So please retain your tickets for this to ensure a smooth entry to that particular locale. Here you will also find some copies of the May issue of Archis magazine, which is this month a UK special analysing aspects of British architectural culture, which I have collaborated on with Ole Bouman, our first speaker, who is editor-in-chief of the magazine. Please look out for it. It's probably one of the first architectural magazines ever to feature the body language of politicians as opposed to their aspirations in built form on the cover, I should say. But first, let's wet our whistles, and I should take another drink of water. Wet our whistles with this Dutchness thing. The event is a direct descendant of the public architectural talk series Spaced Out, held at the ICA over the last few years. My aim as curator of the third and final series there last year was to give attention to ways of looking at architecture that were multidisciplinary in focus. In scope and in consequences, the themes of these seminal events aspired to transcend issues of nationality and territory. So, in considering Dutchness and what it is as a state of mind, a global theme, and as a process, rather than as a buccaneering exportation of tulips, redefinitions of its context, the state of architecture, play an active, critical role in achieving a desirable fluidity of perspectives. Fundamental to this fluidity is an appreciation of other levels of value and value systems, by which I mean the language of architecture, monetary values, and social values defined and experienced through the programme. The laws governing each of these are not commensurate, but when it comes to architecture, all are very important at different stages of its making. The trick is to get them in balance. Architecture, defined as the process of exploring their interconnections, is surely something that is at the heart of darkness, the heart of Dutchness. That's a darkness and Dutchness. We could talk about that one. So that was the preamble, and now I have great pleasure in introducing our first speaker, Ole Bouman, who's a writer and cultural historian at the heart of the Dutch architectural world. He is editor-in-chief of Archis, the magazine for architecture, city, and visual culture. And he's also the author of several books, including The Invisible in Architecture, published in 1994, which was a colossal manifesto and an interdisciplinary study of the social circumstances of architecture, contemporary architecture. He also has written and published And Justice for All from the same year, a collection of essays on politics and visual culture, and Architecture on the Edge of Two Millennia, published last year. He has curated exhibitions including Real Space in Quick Times, the Dutch entry to the 1996 Milan Triennale, working with a team including the architects Van Berkel and Bos, whose presence is here in the person of Caroline Bos. This interactive project, uniquely of all the 31 participating countries, entries, took architecture and digitization as its topic. Last year, Ole Bouman curated another fine exhibition, Egotecture, on the historical relationship between personal identity and architectural space, which was for the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam, selected from its permanent collections. Ole, welcome to the AA.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I will go into the relationship between darkness and Dutchness coincidentally somewhere in my lecture, and I will refer to the introduction at the right moment. And I will also pull up my clothing, but just that one. All right, well, just to begin, thanks for being here, dear audience. And before I start my discourse, I just want to explain what you will see on the screen, which might be considered as a sort of sacrilege maybe, because as far as I know, and I think I'm quite objective in that, is the AA is of course a school of sharp shapes, of fantastic forms, of an incredible research into the formal development of architecture, and much more, of course. And the topic I will talk about today is maybe the opposite. It's maybe non-form. Well, I just have to admit it. It's almost about non-form. I think that's something which is in Holland quite at stake right now. How can architecture deal with non-form? And as a compensation, I'm sure that Caroline Bos, who is also here to talk to today, will show a couple of architectural pieces which exactly shows that this is not the whole story, that there is also a fine development of formal research in Holland. Right, well, 3 days ago I was in Aberdeen, where the Royal Incorporation of Scottish Architects organized their yearly convention. And the theme of this year they had chosen was the Dutch experience. And they wanted to learn from the Dutch to set up a new architecture policy now, since they received some autonomy, are able to define a couple of cultural things themselves. So that may say something about the eagerness of Scotland to learn from the Dutch. But when I bought The Guardian yesterday, I found an article by Jonathan Glancy, who wrote about the new task force on social housing just set up for the Blair government. And just to quote one line, may say something about the more universal admiration that seems to be around for the Dutch situation. He says, Jonathan Glancy says, Lord Rogers and co. need to show people what's on offer to encourage, excite, and cajole a suspicious nation into the joys of modern living. If the Dutch can do it, we can. So one might say the Netherlands is really back on the international scene, and reasons it at least can be deduced of the events I just mentioned, and also from the tulip mania that currently gripping the world as far as the architectural magazines are concerned. Not a month goes by without some important of these magazines devoting an entire issue to Dutch architecture, even without the excuse of an award or an exhibition, or of some Dutch architect receiving a major commission. Nor is the attention focused on just a few aspects. All and everything, from the continually avant-gardist, jet-lagged avant-gardist Rem Koolhaas to the mainstreamer Peter Bruin, and from the design of websites to that of entire landscapes, is investigated and praised. So, really, what has happened over the last few years? Well, in the first place, the economy has revived. And this is important. The Dutch are everywhere. All over the world, they are buying oil pipelines, supermarket chains, insurance companies, banks, plantations, and shares in foreign companies. And instead of galleons and warships, the means they are using to conquer the world today are anonymous transactions, company mergers, and new businesses. It amounts to a genuine golden age, which is today called the polder model. Literally translated, claimed land model. So these are the years of plenty for the building sector. The virtualization of economy is not so far advanced as to undermine the traditional relationship between prosperity and construction boom. The big boys are looking at big profits. Those who bought stock in major companies like HBG, MBM Amsterdam, Ballas Nedam 3 years ago have seen their capital multiply. So to this should be added the fact that the vision of the future entertained by the current liberal socialist political class chiefly finds expression in projects for hard infrastructure. So the reason why the building industry is going through a magical time is clear. Just as the old political extremes of right and left are working together in harmony, a wind of pragmatism is blowing through the construction world, and architects are complaining less and less about the loss of a mandate and taking more and more delight in exploring new fields of activity. Thus, at every level, designers are no longer being sought just for the finished product, but involved in city planning, in structural conceptions, in strategic planning, and anything else you care to think of. For those who know something about how to play the game of consensual democracy, there's much to be gained. And of course, for those who are not so well versed in that, there's much to lose. However things may be, what predominates at the moment is the consciousness that ideological correctness no longer leads to an interesting portfolio of commissions. At the same time, however, this does not necessarily mean a gratuitous yielding to the market. The slides you see is just a reality check. We do a small tour through Holland just to give you an impression what's really going on. In addition to the flourishing of the building industry, it is possible to list other examples of the revival of architecture's faith in itself. And the first is the enormous amount of attention that the local and national authorities have been paying to architecture in the broad sense in recent years. And in fact, 2 governmental policy papers on architecture, national governmental policy papers, have come out and are being implemented very seriously. The first, Space for Architecture from '93, was concerned chiefly with the definition of quality and the mandate of the institutions that were supposed to contribute to the promotion of this quality. And the second paper, the reverse of it, The Architecture of Space, from '96, contained an overview of all those aspects of spatial planning that could turn into architectural commissions. Thus, city planning, landscape architecture were brought within the purview of architectural policy, and the document was signed by a total of 4 responsible ministers. In addition to the more obvious ones, the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Housing, there were also the signatures of the Minister of Transport and Water and of Agriculture and Natural Heritage. And this signified in actual fact that even the problem of the environment was being considered in terms of architecture, and that the hot political topic of the planning of mass infrastructures had been placed on the agenda of architectural debate. The people involved in this debate have seized the opportunity offered them. Discussion has never been so intense and probing as over the last 2 years. Practically every available hall, every architect's cafe, every school and every exhibition space has been booked up far in advance for discussion evenings, shows, citizens' talks, and so on. Anyone with the slightest connection with the planning of space has made his voice heard within the national round of debate. The authorities at once treated the quote-unquote debate on space as a fait accompli and started to organize concrete discussions of major projects far in advance. Magazines and newspapers did not let this trend in society pass unheeded and have given ample coverage to the new projects, the new plans, the new strategies. So it seemed that the public at large was finally getting involved in the field and taking a positive attitude, rather than remaining on the sidelines and expressing its usual negative views. And there is really nothing to wonder at the fact that the Dutch model is arousing just some envy abroad, not just from the economic viewpoint, but also from the democratic one. And now I'm really going into excess. The Netherlands has once again a lesson to teach to the rest of the world. Holland can go back to being a guiding nation, as some Calvinists might say, even if, for its own part, the country has quite enough of this sort of missionary rhetoric. The Italian weekly L'Espresso has carried a splendid image of this situation. And now we come to this Heart of Darkness theme. An article on the principal urban centers of the European Union was accompanied by an infrared satellite view of the continent by night. And while the dense agglomerations of all the other countries could be recognized as bright stars, the Netherlands looked like a single brilliant supernova. It seemed as if in the region of the Rhine-Meuse Delta, the 24-hour economy was literally emitting light into darkness. Right. Before becoming absurd altogether, it's high time to make a shift in this lecture. So let's talk about architecture. If we ask ourselves what role is being played by architecture in this boom, we cannot be just optimistic. It is no longer automatically the case that architecture derives the advantage that might be expected from the soaring economy. On the contrary, architectural practice, in many cases still conducted in small firms, often seems fall victim to the enormous expansion of scale that can be observed in the distribution of commissions, in the building industry, and in funding. New railroad lines, port facilities, or completely new residential districts within the framework of the national housing policy are such complex undertakings that architects frequently have a hard time keeping their feet amidst all the political dithering that accompanies these projects. And the instruments they employ are antiquated. Their professional profile is inadequate, and the image they have of themselves sometimes much too weak. But these professional dynamics are not the only factor in determining the role given to design in the process of construction. No way. Two concrete causes can be identified, and now I come to this non-form topic. Two concrete causes can be identified for the change in the architect's status that have a direct influence on the position of the independent project. The first of these is the weakening of the role of form as the essence of the project. With the increase in scale and in flexibility that is taking place everywhere, there is less and less need for the end results to be defined in a definitive final image. The very area in which architects and city planners used to excel by definition, producing a coherent form, an integrated object, and a suitable context for a given program, in addition to supervising its realization, is less valued in the present range of skills. In fact, they find they have their hands full dealing with organization, budget control, increase in flexibility, and so on. It's not rare for censure of the architect's contribution to be taken to the point where attention to form is directly equated with an excess in costs. And when large and therefore costly projects are in question, such a view is, of course, immediately fatal. After all, it could be said that the conception of form as a means of civilization, long an axiom of architectural design, has had its day. What matters now is the ability to organize, the development of new techniques, and the reconciliation of opposing interests. The architect has to be a master of balance. And the second factor that I would like to single out as playing a crucial part in the new situation is the breakdown of the so-called trickle-down system. For a long time, it was taken for granted that the peak of quality would have an effect on the lower reaches of culture. By definition, the medium scale took the exceptional as its model. The avant-garde had the natural role, supported by the specialist literature, of defining the standards to which the lesser gods aspired without question. The international star system was the last and fatal step in this process. While the avant-garde has continued to hold an undisputed position at the summit, this does not mean that the second and third rung want to compete with it. Indeed, it could almost be said that the avant-garde has frequently been used as an alibi, a fig leaf for a mass production devoid of any creative ambition. The great attention paid by the public to exceptions does not tell us much about the vitality of architecture. Professional journals have rarely seen this development as a problem, continuing to publish one masterpiece after another. They have failed to investigate the effect of this proliferation of quality on the mass production of buildings. Also, the foreign interest in the Dutch miracle has been directed disproportionately at talented individuals, which is very justified, but maybe not the whole story. It is my conviction that the cultural significance of architecture in the Netherlands, in spite of all the lip service, is powerfully constrained by what I call the zoning of talent. It is a situation that has long been unproductive, that gets in the way of exploiting the opportunities which arise in a majority of projects. So, to bring this discourse to a close, I would like to point out that the situation I have described is not necessarily a calamity. Definitely not. In fact, the current period of great changes in the technological field, in the organization of processes, and even in mentality is not just bringing down the curtain on certain traditions, but also opening the door to new options. What is needed is a new conception of quality, in which it's no longer in which it is no longer seen as the core of the exceptional, but as a potentiality for the average. I shall attempt to list, drawing on the situation of Dutch architecture, a number of occasions in which it appears possible to attain the goal of quality within quantity, and to really investigate large numbers. In doing so, we shall put behind the familiar dialectics between the uniqueness of the masterpiece on the one hand and the banality and the mediocrity of mass production on the other. Dialectics well known in this country ever since the first sentence of the famous book by Nicolaus Pevsner, distinguishing between Lincoln Cathedral and a bicycle shed. So we need to devise a new approach. And here we shall find possibilities to bring out an improvement, really, in the quality of the mass of buildings constructed. And 3 fields of action can be distinguished here: mentality, process, and techniques of design. First, changing the mentality and the self-image of the architect is at once the most important aspect and the one that is most difficult to achieve in the current situation. It entails revising the now faded image of the architect as the single author and supervisor of the whole process, leading from the idea to its realization. And this role, along a necessary condition for the attainment of quality, is often cultivated to such an extent that, apart from a few professionals of a high repute given prestigious cultural commissions, clients are less and less willing to entrust architects with traditional tasks. Instead, the architect is reduced to the role of a consultant on aesthetics when he or she is not excluded altogether. The attachment to the image of the universal artist only serves to speed up this process, and in the long run represents a threat for the whole of architecture. In the Netherlands, the country of consensus culture par excellence, this position is growing increasingly untenable. Rather than taking a position of an authoritarian type, architects need to broaden their horizons in terms of comparison and conviction, of networking and organization. To turn this situation into something more than a narrow system of clientele, a conscious change in the self-image is required, in which the appreciation and recognition of the contribution made by others should be an integral part. Directly connected with this is re-examination of the concept of form as the essence of architectural thought. Architects who are capable of abandoning their authoritarian position as authors will have less difficulty in adapting their personal style. In itself, this may signify a reduction in the cultural radiation of architecture. Now, that is already the practice for new types of clients to invest their money in flexible systems rather than in monuments to their power and prestige. Architects may also take on a role different from that of the inaccessible representative of a personal style. They can turn their talents to other aspects of design than those of the facade and the outward appearance. I would not be surprised, if these aspects turned out to be much more ample in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, with its ancient Protestant tradition of formal reserve, can act as a pioneer in this direction. With this, we arrive at the reorganization of the process of construction. The second point. Traditionally, the client came to an agreement with the architect on a design and a budget, and the architect supervised the progress of a work in his own name, and in that of his client, of course. Today, this model of operation is more of an exception than the rule. Clients in charge of complex organizations and huge budgets, and made cautious by the great mistakes that have been made in the past, are far more inclined to bring in many other figures alongside the architect, giving them the same level of responsibility from the outset: consultants, contractors, constructors, plant engineers, jurists, building coordinators, accountants, and so on. As long as these figures are regarded as bothersome meddlers, the architect will be faced by nothing but conflict. And where energy is wasted in conflict, the opportunity for collaboration is lost. In the Netherlands, the contribution of third parties is increasingly being seen as a possibility for the enrichment of architecture. Indeed, it is sometimes even regarded as part of the work of design. When these new figures are no longer turned to just for the skills for which they have been hired, but also for the creativity that they bring in as people, it is possible to broaden the perspective of both sides. The normalization of the organization of the processes described above and the formation of new alliances ought to take place to a large extent during the phase of training. In recent years, the Netherlands has seen a major shift towards specialization in the education of architecture, with students of architecture selecting a particular role at a very early age. Some of them have learned everything about design, others about supervision of the process, and others still about product development. Yet to achieve a successful reorganization of the process, in which all those involved are prepared to learn from others, what is required is a kind of training that places the accent on a very broad orientation, on learning, to put it another way, the language of others. The Netherlands has a very refined form, and that's another thing, of collegial control among architects. By law, all architectural plans have to be submitted to a general board, which passes judgment on the quality of the project and its insertion into the context. While it does its job in a very discreet manner, the board is an extremely powerful body, these are the amenities committees, with an incalculable significance for the quality of the built environment. The sole problem is that the judgment is always expressed during the final stages of a project. Any modifications, therefore, tend to be cosmetic and aimed exclusively at satisfying the desires of that board. As a result, the integrity of the project often suffers in the name of its realization. Research is currently underway on how to extend the role of the board so that it can intervene at a less advanced stage of the project, at which the architect can take into account a series of explicit criteria that are valid for the point in question. The debate over these criteria also needs to be encouraged, of course. So now I come to the last point, the renewal of design techniques. A number of different aspects of these can be distinguished, both conceptual and technological in nature. One important conceptual technique that is on the rise is the use of diagrams to solve complicated tasks. Planners like, for instance, and architects like, for instance, in the office of van Berkel and Bos, are trying to devise urbanistic strategies that are capable of analyzing many more variables than is currently the practice. By carrying out a diagrammatic analysis of forces at a preliminary stage, it is possible to reveal potentialities of a given program. And I'm sure Caroline Bos will go into that later. In this, the computer has played an important role. As far as diagrams are concerned, this chiefly entails the use of animation software, which makes it possible to see the forces in question actually at work, facilitating the choices to be made. Of course, the computer represents an innovative factor in many other ways as well. The first, of course, the computer-aided design. The uses made of this in the Netherlands are very diverse. For instance, to check intuition, like Cas Oosterhuis, the architect from Rotterdam, does, or to produce metaphors of fluidity, like Lars Spuitbroek of the Office of Knox is doing, or to investigate extremes of construction or the characteristics of flows, or to rationalize the process from project to production, like the Office of Swartz and Jansma are doing. Taken all together, they are giving rise to a lively debate. I'm sure this debate is, I know this debate is quite lively in this school as well. In addition to computer-aided design, a whole range of applications are to be found in the field of domotica, domotics. On the initiative of the multinational Philips in particular, a great deal of research is carried out over the last few years into intelligent technologies in the field of security, climate control and ecology. And recently, Philips Lighting organized a workshop in which major international architects, renowned architects, participate, trying to find new ways to animate architecture with a completely uninteresting form by means of all kinds of lighting systems and projection and sensor technologies. So Philips is a major, takes a major part in this. There's also much at stake where the integration between architecture and plant technology is concerned. And in this field, industry has a big part to play as big a part to play as the world of culture, as with the V2 organization on new media in Rotterdam, for instance. Another important element in the adoption of new methods in the design of space is the need for the formation of work groups. This is also a technique to form the formation of work groups, research groups, design teams. There are areas of knowledge so specialized that no architect, planner or designer knows in advance how to handle them. He will be continually enriching the project with the advice and technical contributions of other participants, as I said before. The situation has gradually become structural, really, with the result that it is possible to speak of a new condition. Architecture has become the art of organization. Well, it's time to draw some conclusions from all this. As the Netherlands is going through a period of prosperity and the design of space is attracting wide interest in society, there are numerous opportunities, given the revolutionary developments that are taking place in architecture, city planning, of course, and landscape design of new impulses toward quality. Observing the emerging practices of producing space in the Netherlands, one can be seduced into thinking that architecture has substantially changed its nature and become provision of spatial frameworks, the organization of program and flows, the play with regulations and restrictions, and many other formless activities. It seems that there is an enlargement or reprioritization of the usual practices of architecture, the designing of built objects as it was, architecture as it was, the designing of built objects, the occupation of land, the implementation of higher values. All this encourages a completely different outlook and definition of the profession of architecture and strongly suggests that architects, after losing their status in an ever more complex building process, are finding finally a new mandate, a mandate which might be called space directing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ole, for your big introduction to what is a very big theme. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Caroline Bos, an art historian and someone whose practice is very well known to many of you, if not all of you, not just through the media, but through her partner Ben van Berkel's teaching here at the AA. Together, Caroline and Ben founded Van Berkel Bos Architectuurbureau in Amsterdam in 1988. And since that time, their presence in the Dutch architectural world has built up with considerable force, with realized projects including the Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam, the Carbouw and Ecom office buildings, the Remy electricity station, and innumerable housing projects. In Germany, they built the Aedes East Gallery in Berlin, and more recently in the Netherlands, the Twente Museum in Enschede. They're currently completing a master plan for the city of Arnhem in the east. The private Mobius House in Gore and a new museum for the city of Nijmegen. Both Caroline and Ben are, as it will not have escaped your attention, very prolific writers and have published numerous media features and many books, including Delinquent Visionaries in 1993, Mobile Forces in 1994, and in 1995, El Croquis published a monograph issue on their work. Caroline, welcome to the AA. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, on our next visit here, we will also provide a course so everyone can even pronounce then all the Dutch cities correctly, as it seems a little bit like an invasion what we are doing here, but it's certainly not meant like that from my point of view. And I cannot claim to have any objective perspective on Dutch architecture, and cannot stand with it. And even I feel a little bit strange being here in what's, as Lucy referred to, is more Ben's territory for me than mine. But it's very nice to be here in any case. Maybe we can have the first slides on and the lights out. As Lucy said, it's true that for us, part of our project is teaching, writing, doing competitions, doing new projects, some of which very large scale, in which we do a lot of research. And to us, all this together forms a sort of continuous research. This first project that I'm showing here is an exhibition that we had in New York last year, where we wallpapered a relatively small room with images of all the projects we had done since we started in 1988-89. And what we meant to convey is that you have, in a situation where you have a lot of production, as we have in the Dutch situation, you can divide your experiment over a series of projects. So this is what I want to show two examples of later on as well. So you can work out a theme and hopefully let it mature a little bit more than it would have if you had to do everything in a single life's work. But of course, this doesn't go just for projects that you choose special themes for, but for all your production. Because as you go along, you will be working, you will be doing maybe 10 projects at the same time. Well, maybe that's too much, maybe 6, but at least 22 per year we usually do, of which some, of course, are small study projects. And so the projects influence each other. And this is also why we chose in this representation to have the projects themselves only shown very small in these light color bits, and more the diagrams, the images that were instrumental in the generation of those projects. They are shown in a larger format. Another thing that is important to mention right away is the specific condition in which we work that Ole also referred to, that the position of the architect has already become very non-hierarchical. Ben has described it sometimes as a sort of a John Cage. You are not directing from a central position in front of your orchestra, but as you walk around, you try to involve the participants in your process. But what also happens if you work with so many people on different levels, consultant levels, but also all the committees that Ole mentioned. If you do a large project like the Erasmus Bridge, you work with 5 different departments, you go through many social strata, and all these people have to develop their own concepts of control. And this is also something that, that needs to be remembered. And of course, that is part of a very specific Dutch culture at the moment, I suppose. I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking too much about Dutchness. On the other hand, it's very Dutch to say, well, I'm one of the only ones who's not Dutch. I'm not a very Dutch type of person. So it is a very difficult situation to get out of. And the only comfort I have is that a lot of the books that I see on the bestseller list all seem to deal with this theme, which is how you work with your own local identity, which is part of the background that you come from, and still realize you are part of a global culture. And this goes from, if you read books on Chinese mothers or people and their specific Indian childhood, maybe this is a related sort of thing. One of the experiments that I was mentioning that have been going on in our practice now for 2-3 years, and which are worked on in several projects, are those on new concepts of organizing and structuring. And well, this is of course familiar to many of you who have worked with Ben here, because his teaching here centers very much on that. And I should mention that his teaching is such an integral part of our whole practice, because he the ideas that he develops here with you, we will of course immediately use. So thank you. The question that has been intriguing, has been intriguing is it's actually, there are 2 questions. The first is how to instrumentalize the new social public space, which is often a media space. If you think of the planet with all its satellites that now connect our life in a different way. But in an example like Los Angeles, you see also how the gridded urban structure is countercrossed by a far more dynamic structure of the infrastructure. And this is in the diagram also shown how you have how the linear structure of a grid-like structure, which with its equal potential division, which is a very effective way of organizing things, but which can be how the element of, for instance, time and movement can be worked into that sort of structuring. And a second question is, which is related, and is also very closely related to the talk that Ole gave, is how do you instrumentalize the political and cultural imagination for these contemporary structures? And this is particularly something that an architect can do, of course, because still, even when you are losing a lot of control, which we have thought is not something that is very useful to only complain about, but, and here maybe the issue of pragmatism comes in, to accept the situation in the way it is, not be nostalgic, and try to be a master builder in a situation where 30% of your building budget could go to installations, but instead try to be an influence in coordinating and integrating all these different aspects. And that question of new ways of inclusive structuring is seen in the following project. This is our sort of studies which are not dealing directly with the project. The little diagram was of an earlier urban project, actually, which again shows this equal potential system and a new use which can incorporate time and movement. And the reference next to it is a sculpture or installation piece, whatever, by Jeff Koons called The New. And because these studies pertain to a museum project, they are of interest. Again, the purely structuring of the piece is similar, because you have, again, this rigid division in which these hoovers are placed, but there are inevitable differences, for instance, in the way the wiring is organizing itself, but also hoovers are interesting machines. They are breathing machines, and this is related to the museum projects that these relate to, because a museum in Holland is these days one big breathing machine, because of some Delta plan for cultural preservation, which regulates the climate control, and this is very strict, and the museums have to incorporate a lot of equipment to fulfill those regulations. And what we did in this new museum, which we are presently building and which will be finished in September, is study how we could incorporate those installations in the ceiling. So here you see studies which could measure how heat goes up and collects in different places where you have more people, and then at that point the ceiling, which is a waving ceiling, would have to be acquire bigger waves to incorporate more equipment. Here on the for you, the left side, you see the a model of this ceiling, and on the other side is an older museum we did, the one that Lucy also referred to in Enschede, and there the installations, it's an extension of a museum, and the installations are here in the walls where the air comes in and comes out again at the ceiling. It is this image shows the roofing over of an existing courtyard, and the columns are placed also on the places where you have the existing structure. But the main aspect of this integrated approach is that you have the machines, the distribution of the program, and the routing. You try to incorporate them in one structure. This is a large-scale mock-up of the ceiling in the Nijmegen Museum, and because also the lighting comes from there. And in the other slide, again, of the other museum, you see how light and material also have an organizing effect on the structure. The way you walk through it, light plays a part in it. And again, it's integrated with the structure because this light wall is hanging from the ceiling and leaves space open. There's an old existing window behind that light box. And if you were a curator, you could maybe put, even use that space to put something on the floor. Here the person is testing out how to disintegrate the ceiling, because you have to get behind it all the time to change if something needs to be changed, light bulb or something like that. And as it transpired that actually we got more and more waves into the ceiling as the constructors realized that, and the installation technicians especially, realized that they could make use of that and in a sense delay their own decisions by asking us to make another wave if they needed another box. Here you see the small mock-up of the ceiling in the builder's own shed, and later an entire room was made on the other side to test out the effect also for the light, because of course the museum directors were worried that they would get funny stripes on their art, so they brought special old art to hang on the mock wall, because it's going to be a complex museum which brings three entirely different collections together. Here you see the museum in its context. It's for a Dutch situation quite unusual, because it's on a slope, and this determines this stair going up is then carried through into the building, where it leads to a balcony zone on the other side from the entrance, where on the upper level you have the museum floors, and the balcony zone gives a view over the countryside. Studies of the ceiling now in relation to the internal division, which consists of parallel streets with openings, so that you can get that effect that you will get people moving freely through it, also directed by the light as it comes through the different places. And here you see the central staircase lifted out of the model, which is at the same time branches off to the different programmatic functions in the museum, and is also the main structural element of it. Through the roof you can see the undulating movement of the entire ceiling. You can see also the parallel streets, and as you can see on the zebra crossing, people also feel free to move in a personal way through the museum space. The next project I will show is the Möbius house, and this house is the diagram of that is the clay drawing, and is the generator of the project, in the sense you can read it, for instance, as the how two people will live together in a house. It's in a sense an image of 24 hours in the life of a couple. The site, the location, is a landscape in Holland, and because of regulations and the position of the building had to be like that. It had to be a long strip in the landscape, which also is like the house. Because of that, we thought the house could be like a walk through the landscape if you live in it. Here you see the landscape itself, and there you see a diagram mapping. The couple also have 2 children, mapping their activities in different spaces over the day. The long image is all the rooms of the house placed, all the spaces placed next to each other instead of intertwined as they are in reality. And in the model you can see how, although it's called the Möbius house, it is a Möbius band more in its spatial effect when you go through the house than in its real structure. Constructively, it is this double lock torus. As you see, the ends of the house don't meet. So this is where the people have their separate rooms. They work at home, and so each of the couple has his own workroom at another end of the house. Early studies how the volume of the house takes in the 4 quadrants of the landscape, and how each string would behave itself. In another way to read the diagram would be to see it as the 2 main materials, the glass and the concrete, which also have this relation that they cross each other. Here too you see the integral approach, that the construction is completely absorbed in all aspects of the building and becomes also part of the furniture, and the staircase comes down and so on. I think probably many people have already seen it. At the moment it is lived in, but not photographed yet, so it's completely ready, and we hope to show you to you later this year, when when we hope also to have finished our next book with latest projects. And here again a diagram, also taking in the 24-hour cycles of living. This house, some people have said, it's interesting, but it's not flexible. It was a house that was made in very close cooperation, as private houses often are. I think that the person who is going to live in the house is to a large extent the author of the project, or at least it is their self-portrait, maybe, in which the architect is someone who is almost a psychologist and has to understand their what they want and help them make that into an architectural shape. This other house has some of the same principles in that it also has this integral aspect, and the integration of the construction and the distribution of the program and the routing system. But in this project, the rooms are far less specific, simply because that was what these people preferred. But they were unfortunately so unspecific that they dropped the whole project later on. But what is this house, what is a special interesting experiment in the organization of the structure is that in the center of the house is a void from which the different planes and rooms emerge instead of so although it is like a mushroom in some ways, the core is a void rather than a thick core. I will stop now because otherwise I will go on into the next project, and I think it's been enough, so thank you.
Okay, now we're going to fast forward through, well, it's 7:45, so we still have plenty of time. To imagine the architectural scene in recent years without the contribution of Charles Jencks is pretty unthinkable. As an author and a lecturer, his distinctive approach has been described as creating historical diagrams, pigeonholing particularities within essentials. But this pigeonholing description doesn't fully convey the deeply influential level on which his writing is operated, nor the wide-ranging and fertile nature of his themes, ranging from symbolic architecture to cosmogenesis. His publication, Meaning in Architecture, from 1969, introduced one of the new directions in the interpretation of architecture and style. The language of postmodern architecture has run to 6 editions since its release in 1991, and this was followed by Heteropolis in 1993, Architecture Today in 1994, already in 3 editions, and last year the Architecture of the Jumping Universe, already in its 2nd edition. Besides this, there have been other works on contemporary building and postmodern thought. Charles Jencks's architecture, landscape, and design and furniture explore the ideas developed in his writing. He will now respond to the first 2 speakers' presentations and to the conceptual thrust of our provocative Dutchness question. And after this, we will have an open platform debate. And finally, and without too much delay, because of the time factor, throw the symposium open to a discussion with questions from the audience. So please feel free to intervene in this free-for-all. Charles Jencks, thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's something very tantalizing and rather teasing about the question proposed to you tonight. Is there a Dutchness in, I suppose, Dutch architecture? Teases the brain. You could think, and one does think, of cuisine. Is there Italian cuisine? Of course there is. Is there Chinese cuisine? Yes. Is there French cuisine? Assuredly. But is there Dutch cuisine? Well, I don't know. So this Dutchness, raises that difficult question, not only of cuisine, but nationality. And also a kind of philosophical problem of the circularity of these definitions, which are partly and have to be partly based on our perceptions of going to Holland or watching lots of Dutch people show their slides here at the AA, which also brings up the question, is Dutchness, through Ben Berkel, really AA-ness? When that question was proposed in a kind of implicit way. In other words, the nationality which is clearly perceivable, like all these cuisines. I mean, the question should tease you and tantalize you. It obviously is referring to something very real, having partly to do with self-reflexivity of perceived movements, that we perceive something that things have in common and then we give them a label. And giving them the label, of course, changes how we perceive them because it brings certain parts out and diminishes other parts. I can think, say, in when regionalist movements and national movements became very strong in the turn of the century, a good example of that is with Antonio Gaudí and a movement which I couldn't begin to pronounce in Catalan, but something like Renaissance of the culture, but it later termed modernismo, and now known as setting a kind of Catalan style or Catalan architecture, or in the 60s, the Barcelona school. So simply by sort of being creative and good enough, Gaudí and modernismo architects invented their own category and then became perceived as typifying that category, and that category was then perceived as local to Barcelona. So through feedback and reiteration, it became, in a sense, a national or at least a regional style. Now, one of the great problems of this was, well, it's been recognized as a problem, particularly in Anglo-Saxon philosophy for over 150 or 190 years since Hegel started talking about national spirits, or the spirit of the age as seen through nations, particularly the German nation, which was challenging France for its supremacy in Europe. And I can remember in this room, Isaiah Berlin speaking in a most extraordinary way about whether Romanticism, in German Romanticism, was caused by, and going from Goethe all the way up to Hitler, was caused by the Germans not feeling a sense of inferiority because they couldn't be as civilized as the French, as good-looking as the French, and have high Rococo style. They invented, as a result, a kind of characterfulness and truth and honesty and sincerity and all those romantic qualities, which then became associated with the Romantic movement and later Germanness. Anyway, in this country, one of the emigres from that German nationalism, Nicholas Pevsner, embarrassedly enough, wrote a book around 1950, I can't remember the date, called The Englishness of English Art. And everybody blushed madly because they wanted it to be true, but they didn't believe it, and it was being described anyway by a German emigre, a greater pigeonholer than even me, Pevsner. And he, like a good Hegelian, took a lot of English, or at least British, things and said, now, what do they all have in common? And I can't really remember much about the book, but he looked at Gloucester Cathedral, I think. He looked at William Hogarth, and he looked at a few other quintessentially British, maybe Stubbs, and William Blake, and he said, what do they all have in common? Well, clearly, Englishness, if you subtract other things. It's like one of those tricks that a magician plays. But basically, it wasn't convincing as an argument, and it was embarrassing because at that time in the 50s, everybody was trying to be international, and the Second World War had sort of made nationhood highly suspect. So this argument, which has, of course, gone on since Hegel, and gone on in architecture since the international style was a term coined by, well, let's say maybe not coined, but written by Walter Gropius in 1925, or international architecture, as he rather would put it, and then re-minted by the American architectural historian Hitchcock and then architect Philip Johnson, to become the leading label for what was clearly an identifiable movement, an identifiable style. That internationalism, which of course was associated with the political internationalism of not only the Third International and communism, but a global movement, All of that internationalism threw into doubt, as globalism throws into doubt, the notion that a regional culture can exist and resist the center or globalization today. And of course, Kenneth Frampton has written, as indeed I have at length, on different modes of resistance and what I call double coding and what he calls critical regionalism is a kind of acknowledgement that it has to be both global and local. Anyway, is there a Dutchness in Dutch architecture, or should one say, is there a neo-Dutch Dutchness in Dutch architecture? In the 20s, British architects often went to Holland to look at the work of Oud and Rietveld and de Stael in general, and you could say there was a natural affinity between, again, architects in this school and architects around the Architectural Review and the Dutch. And we can find those affinities of experience in Mediterranean countries, for instance, between Italian and Spanish architects and nations, just as we can with northern nations. In fact, there was Rainer Banham postulated several times whether there was a northern architecture, a Nordic architecture, in the sense of wood architecture, Norwegian slightly, but Scandinavian in any case, which was also shared throughout a certain hemisphere, a certain line. I'm reminded of this recent computer study known as geodemographics, where people with market researchers can tell almost exactly what everybody is eating, drinking, reading, thinking, valuing, and to what degree. They're doing these studies, of course, in order to sell products, but they have discovered some such unlikely things as a north-south divide in America known as the mayonnaise belt. And everybody above it has Hellman's mayonnaise, and everybody below has Kraft mayonnaise, and it represents someness that one should think about somehow. Anyway, you can see I'm skeptical, but not completely. I'm tortured and teased by this. And when I thought of it tonight, I mean, before listening and really reading about it, I thought, yes, well, there is a kind of smallness, the kind of thing that Rem Koolhaas has been trying to escape for the last 40 years. The Vermeerism, de Hooch, if you'll excuse my pronunciation, and something that was very apparent in the slides that Ole showed at the very beginning. But I don't think that's being put forward here, certainly. But it's recognizable, like a cuisine. Secondly, there's a green practice, a kind of radical eco-architecture, which we didn't see anything about, which comes from building polders and living in the sea, as it were, for 500 or 600 years, and having to reinvent a second nature. Thirdly, there's an obvious Calvinism, which I think was mentioned in Scotland when some of these issues were discussed, and which is conveyed and apparent rather than named, a kind of degree zero architecture, which is socially motivated, which is lightweight, and which, well, actually, it was Ole Bouman spoke about it as related to a kind of formlessness. But again, that brings up the question whether that is also related to other international movements. I'm slightly feeling that because of the presence of Rem Koolhaas, even if he lives in this country but spends the week mostly in Holland, and has had such an enormous influence on recent Dutch architecture, that it's Koolhaas, if there is a Dutchness, it's Koolhaas über alles. So Dutchness could be Remness. And maybe that's true or not true. I don't know whether there's a Dutch school or there's a Rem school. But let me just put forward 6 buildings. Sorry I don't have slides, but you may know them. If not, they're in recent issues of Archis, which constitute something like a shared corpus, which, like the Catalan architecture of Gaudi, if you like, constitutes a growing school, which, like all great national movements, is both creative and good, and so therefore it may lead to something recognizably Dutch. It was his, I suppose it was his Jussieu library proposal of about 1994, which brought to canonic expression this notion of an unfolding linear landscape route in which a floor is wrapped around a building and punctured by events and structure in an enormously unusual way, so that you didn't know which floor you were on or where you were, except through learning, through looking through the floor and through going through the building. In other words, you could see that it would be mentally, in the first instance, impossible to figure out. But absolutely very exciting to inhabit and to use, because it was like a landscape continuously changing. You could see the problems of it, people living slightly on a tilted floor, and in an office or in a library, people sliding down the floor, books sliding away from you. With the Cool House approach came what was also quite obvious in his work, is that kind of surrealist juxtaposition of heterogeneous material, both living elements and non-living elements, in a way that was which broke down categories. And also his very strong sense of black humor, used as a creative tool of design and urban design. So I do think that Cool House stands behind this, and it has been put to me that the present movement of Dutchness is an attempt to get away from him, but maybe like all movements away from, it also, in a sense, pulls the focus away with it. Another building which is built, and again, excuse my pronunciation, by Lars Springbrook in Kaas Oysterhuis, is the exhibition pavilion devoted to water cycles. It's very much a fluid architecture for fluidity, and it has this, it's a curved steel building with sheet steel that wraps around and is used to house different kinds of water. That relates to some of the work of Meccanu, particularly their recently completed Central Library in Delft, which has, like Rem's work, a very strong tilted ground plane, sometimes covered with grass and sometimes covered with macadam or concrete. Therefore, in Ole's term, a non-building. In this sense, I think there is certainly overlap between all of this work. Eric van Egerath's bank in Budapest, I think, belongs to this tradition, as indeed a lot of the work we've just seen of Van Berkel and Bos. Their Mobius house in particular, but the bridge and other buildings. Finally, the group who I can't pronounce, maybe they're not meant to be pronounced, but they're spelled MVRDV, Mervdiv. They sound like some of that Russian Secret Service, like the Cheka in 1920 that led to disappeared people. And they've produced another acronym called a VUPRO in Hilversum in 1997, that very interesting meandering landscape produced for a multimedia company, a TV company. So I do think there is a very interesting practice here in those 6 buildings, or more than 6 actually, but those instance them. And the real question, though, is whether they are or are not very exclusive to Dutch practice, or whether they're not really part of a much larger world tradition, which I suspect they are, but maybe their inflection is quite recognizable, like a cuisine. So you could argue that where Dutch architecture is most interesting, it is not Dutch, but international. However, when, and if done well enough, it may well become, like Gaudi and Modernismo, identified with a specific culture and time. Thank you.
Charles Jencks' overview of our Dutchness refers to something that he discerns that is very real, a challenging national spirit, also a school. Internationalism and globalism, he is saying, as I understand it, throws into doubt that regional culture can exist. Can it be both global and local? Is this formless nature, is this formlessness related to other international movements? And I would like to ask Ole Bouman what he thinks of these issues, these interconnected issues. Is the architecture part of a larger world practice? Is it more than a degree zero architecture? Or perhaps you want to reposition or repostulate the whole theme anyway?
It can be both at the same time, I think. It can be global and degree zero. It's no problem. Let me just respond to what Charles just said about this distinctive nation vis-à-vis the rest of the world. He was really going into some specifics of not just the contemporary, present situation in Dutch architecture, but also its historical roots, the historical background. And I never know in these kind of circumstances whether to be flattered or insulted, because it can be both ways. Of course, I'm flattered to be detected as a representative of a culture that at least can be distinguished as a separate culture. But maybe the insult is also there, because it's also always a restriction. It's a restriction which is exactly at the core of this topic of Dutchness. I don't think we should interpret a term like Dutchness as Dutch architecture. It's the other way. It's not about the nation. It's about a condition. And that's important. It's not about a territory. It's about an approach. It's not about form or tradition of forms or style even, but it's about attitude. So if Dutchness could be described as Remness, what you did, referring to coal house, I think we should rephrase it. If Dutch architecture has something to do with Remness, we should define it as architecture at random. What I would like to point out is that the problem with Dutchness is that the Dutch not even know themselves that there is something as Dutchness in the international state of architecture, which is very well elucidated by a recent big project that was done last year called the New Map of the Netherlands. After many updates of the official Dutch map, the NIROF, that's the Association of Planners, came up with a new map, which was really reflecting what's going on in the Netherlands today. It was a map of Holland in 2010, and all plans that are now being built or realized or in the design phase were already visible on this map. And one could see that another 12 years and the Netherlands will not be the Netherlands anymore. And the strange thing was that because you could see that the globalization process is really at an incredible speed being implemented in the Netherlands on a territorial level, the contours of this map, the borderlines of this map, were still this very well-known, old-fashioned borderlines of the nation. So you have this let's say this icon of a country in which a process is going on which has nothing to do with that country anymore. And that's what I mean, that the Dutch don't even know themselves that they are in this process, because the Nierhof decided just still to maintain these fixed borders as a kind of cognitive tool. So that's what I mean with Dutchness in my version of it. It's the loss of nationality. It has to do with a condition in which the nation voluntarily drops its national commitment to spatial programs, whether it is housing or infrastructure or whatever, and really locks in to a global process. And I think the Dutch are so willing to do this, are so open to do this, are so eager to do that, that they fulfill a kind of progressive position in that. I mean progressive in the literal sense of the word. And that's my response to Charles.
I'd like to, if I may, ask Caroline to respond to what Charles Jencks has said, and then perhaps we could quickly come back to Charles, and then open it up to the floor. So.
Yeah, I was thinking of also when we briefly talked beforehand, and you told me how Richard Rogers has now attained such an interesting position that he advises the government, and how that difficult something like that would be in Holland, that an architect would, although there I know that it's often published in newspapers and so on, that young architects don't get the same chances that they get in Holland. At the same time, I don't know if people can grow to the sort of stature that you can maybe develop in another way. So there's always a drawback. And another thing that your presentation made me think of, that a part of the Calvinist tradition is that you read a little bit in the Bible, then you go and work more, and still we have sometimes, I think, everyone to face your own condition, but this tendency to maybe want to be expansive, to want to be bigger than you are conditioned to, is related to this quite short periods of reflection and the enormous emphasis on work.
Do you want to, Charles?
Yes, please. Well, I think those are both very interesting comments. Is this working? I think those are both very interesting comments. The first one, Ole, was really surprising, because you didn't say when you were first speaking that Dutchness was about loss of self-identity. It was about not being a nation, but being an international condition of eager to join the global. So eager are the Dutch to join the global that constitutes a kind of Dutchness. I mean so it's very funny what you've done by leaving that until I'd given my talk, and then pulling that out of your back pocket to beat me with. Well, quite right. Yeah. Well, no. I mean, it's good. This brings up the point. That's why it's such a teasing question, isn't it? Although it's, of course, your title, not mine. I mean, I'm only responding to your first thrust, that there is a Dutchness, and now we found out that the Dutchness is actually globalization squared, which is which brings up, I mean, and coupled with the thing about the Calvinists and potato eating and the cuisine, is and not wanting to reflect too much on the situation, except when forced to, and in brief moments. And it brings up this embarrassment, that it always comes with this issue of nationhood and self-identity. I mean, it is often said that the nation is best expressed when it isn't concentrating on itself as a nation. So that insofar as a national cuisine or national expression comes, it comes as a byproduct of other things, a very clear byproduct. And that when, with, say, Blair today, we get Cool Britannia branding the country, it is really an embarrassment, and it's a form of advertising hype. And it's very close to, of course, those movements that so many of the people in the 50s were trying to get away from, the Second World War movements of fascism and neo-nationalism. Now, my own position, though, let me just reiterate, and I think it's that of Frampton. I mean, this is a party pre of certain kind of postmodernism and critical resistance, is that one should consciously form local movements. I think they were the great resistance movements. They were in fact romantic nationalism often in the turn of the century, and they did resist globalization. Not that resisting should be ever complete, but I do think that there's a certain case to be made that that in that resistance is creativity, as long as it doesn't turn into the reactionary nationalism, which of course it did too in the 30s. But we come after all that in any case, and we come in a period of rampant globalization. And so I'm left here wondering whether, I mean, and in a sense, Rem is he's Mr. Euro, and he's 300. He shows those diagrams. He's out of the country 340 days a year. Out of any country, he's in a plane. So he is Mr. Global too. And so then, if I said Dutchness is Remness, you're saying yes, insofar as it's hyper-globalization as a new, eagerly embracing it. It is a kind of hidden part of that. And then, so you and I actually agree that it's good because it's hidden. And maybe we shouldn't be revealing it. Is that right?
You want to keep it this way?
I don't know. It's out of the bag now.
Well, the problem with a term like globalization is, of course, that it seems to be a clear-cut category, but after all, it's an incredibly complex term. And if one says globalization squared, it seems to be just the excess of the simple version of the word. But I think, and that's the effort I did in my lecture, that within that globalization process and within the overwhelming power it has to swallow all kinds of resisting tendencies or traditional entities, I think there are pockets of creativity. There are a lot of. It is not so total. It's not only totalitarian in its working out. There are a lot of free zones in which architecture can find a new mandate, and these were the examples I gave in terms of mentality, in terms of design techniques, and in terms of reorganization of the process.
I think they just turn it on when you speak.
I think it would be a good time, and since time is of the essence, to get some reaction from the audience, if you're not too overwhelmed by the fullness of Dutchness. Does anybody wish to intervene or ask one question? You have a mic.
Another
Control your
very
voice.
Dutch thing that was not mentioned is that, to me it seems that Dutch are never impressed by anything. When Peter Greenaway took his opera Rosa to Europe, it was only in Amsterdam they could actually stage it because it was too crude to play anywhere else in Europe. And the room was filled with journalists from Germany and France and Belgium and all over the place. So it's like they're never impressed with whatever big things they produce within their own country. And in the same way, Rem is doing the same. He's never impressed how big. The bigger it is, he wouldn't be impressed. So I think that's part of the Dutchness as well. That they just, they lift their shoulders and go, okay,
Anyone else? Yeah?
One of the things that I thought was implicit in what Ole was saying to begin with was, and which I, in just reading the title for this, had wondered, was that this thing about is there a Dutchness in architecture, I wasn't expecting it at all to be tied to Netherlands, to Holland. And I think that one of the things that has come through from the discussion is kind of slight nervousness about what constitutes Dutchness in order to say what might be Dutch about architecture outside of that country. So that if you're considering the process of globalization, it's not just about Holland becoming global and becoming completely international. It's about how do you frame an identity for the country which might be exported out and then hybridized and come into dialect with other countries. And I'm particularly interested to know what Ole thinks about that. About how much do you consider Dutchness as something that's outside of the country and goes into dialogue with other cultures and other architecture.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can give an example of a recent shift in the cultural policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, has to do with politics and economical treaties and that kind of things. But they do have a department of cultural affairs. And this department is paying for the cultural attachés all over the world in the embassies. For decades, the package all the cultural collaborators of the embassies got with them when they were sent to the different countries was some books about the tulips, the mills, the wooden shoes, etc. This was the basic production of export product the Ministry of Foreign Affairs could think of. Recently, let's say 2 years ago, there was a shift. All the cultural attachés were called back, and there were different people sent out. Networkers, not exporters, networkers. They should network all over the globe to do something with Holland. But what exactly was not defined. So if you would ask such a networker, what kind of identity, which is a very complicated term, of course, what kind of identity are you advocating? Are you trying to put forward in abroad? They would not answer you. They cannot answer you because there is no identity. Of course, it's not either or. There are a lot of people not hesitating at all to define what the Dutch identity is, but there is a major shift in many of these guys where networkers and refraining from any definition of identity whatsoever. So I think that's a good example in a specific governmental framework of this shift. That's not just a kind of loose philosophy, but it's really a matter of actual practice. Does that respond to your question?
Yeah, it does. But nonetheless, it still seems, particularly within an architectural context, that there must be some kind of attempt to have an identity formation. I mean, it seems to me that the very fact that you people are here, that Archis is projecting itself, there is some attempt to do something which is beyond an absence of identity. And what the condition you've described is just about setting up relations rather than about setting up a sense of some kind of collective identity. Are you suggesting that the architecture is an architecture without any sense of national identity? I didn't think that was what was coming through, and particularly in what you were showing.
Well, if there's anything steady in it historically, I might give an example of. If there's anything steady in this attitude to network and to stay far away from defining an identity, I might refer to a famous letter René Descartes once wrote to a friend, a librarian in Paris, when he wrote his Discours de la méthode, discourse on method, in the 17th century, early 17th century. And he wrote to his friend that in Paris he could never finish his book because he was disturbed endlessly by philosophers who want to discuss with them about the basic premises of his theory. And at last, in Holland, he could finish his work, because there was no Dutch guy who would ever bother to disturb René Descartes defining the ego, defining the cogito, etc., etc., because they were too busy earning money. So maybe that's the steady thing.
Another question over here?
What I liked about Ole's talk was actually that he sort of interpreted Dutchness as not so much as a character but as a tradition, although I'm not quite sure whether there was a hint of irony or some sort of triumphalism involved. It seems to me that a very important factor then is the sort of economic expansion and the development of the economy in the past few years, which really brings up the question, is the Dutchness something to do with the Polder model, and is it also going to completely disappear once that sort of zeepbel, soap bubble is going to sort of burst? If it's so much linked to this very particular economic position.
Well, it's a difficult question. I'm not an economical specialist. I don't know what.
We could assume it might.
Sure, but just as part of the global bubble, you know, it's if you see the stock markets rising by tens of percent each month, in the last 2 or 3 years in Holland, it was really the highest rise of whole Europe. You might think of the end of the bubble once, but then you see all the other stock markets doing the same. So if there is a global debubbling event, then Holland will just go down the drain as well.
Let me just respond polemically for a second to create more heat in this room. How is it really that in response to the question or the approbation of what Ole was saying, how can we really believe that these things that you recognize, or some of you recognize as Dutchness, why are they Dutch? I mean, for heaven's sakes, there are many places around the globe that are booming and busting all the time. Every regional area in Italy has had a boom and bust, and around Milan. Why don't we call it Milanism as a condition? So this is where I'm skeptical of the term, except in a very AA way, of meaning something all to us. I mean, maybe we have a private code here, is what I'm wondering. Whether you could defend this in New York or outside this room. I think we all do know like that. Through self-reflexivity, we can recognize there's something here, and you've identified some of its characteristics, and I've identified some other. But I don't think if you really examined it in any depth, you couldn't show that, for instance, the fluidity or weakness or formlessness are very strong movements. I mean, Eisenman has been going on with philosophers, Vattimo from Italy, about formlessness now for 15 years. Weak form, and so on. And there's, a form in New York is a very strong movement in the art world. But do we say that's New Yorkness, or do we say it's Italianness, or no? But I think we're using the Dutchness. I think you are actually. I think you've lassoed this audience, and we're being too compliant with you. I think we should say that. Why don't we call Dutchness, if not Remness or AA-ness? Why don't we call it something else? Wouldn't you see almost every single definer is non-exclusive, and even taken together, they may have a certain coloration that maybe you can recognize, or you can, or maybe most of you can. I can't. I don't know. Maybe there is a taste. Maybe there's coloration. But why call it Dutchness? What do we gain by that, except a provocation to which I am now responding?
I won't defend a cause, of course, to react on your. If you ask me this, I cannot, intrinsically to my argument, to defend the cause of Dutchness. So if you want me to define something, after de-defining all the time, there we have a problem.
Another question.
Very difficult thing to discuss. I think you need caricature and anecdote from this territory. I built a building model. I will tell you about a meal on the first day there with a table with building contractors, politicians, architects and planners. The Dutchman on my right, after 15 minutes of conversation, said to me, well, of course, what you have to understand is that we Dutch invented business. I then changed the person on my left, who after 15 minutes reassured me that, of course, what I had to understand is that we Dutch invented business. And it seems to me that if you compare Dutchness with Britishness and architects, the British have this terrible fear of the commercial trade, which the Dutch just don't have. And I think what we heard in the first presentation was a discussion of taking the business of architecture into the aesthetic domain. It's almost inconceivable in the Rem. It's very interesting that Rem's big book starts out with those diagrams of air miles and how many people in the office for how long over a period of time in bar charts. And then it gets onto the buildings. It actually claims in a very beautiful way that this is part of this new aesthetic domain of architecture, which for the RIBA would be unimaginable.
And for how long do you think will it be inimaginable? Is that an eternal condition?
Now you're asking about Englishness.
Exactly.
And my guess is quite a long time until it collapses. You could then put bets on how long it is. But I think the Dutch willingness to engage in process and not see it as compromise of some gentlemanly position is actually, I think, very Dutch. And I don't know if in any other countries in Europe.
Well, I talked about final form, design, form at large, as the mediation between program and actual building, architecture. And also in Holland, of course, form, even if there is this pragmatic acceptance of marketing things or commercial things, form was always still the bottom line. What I tried to point out is that in this willingness to embrace or to accept the commercial dimension or the market dimension in the design domain, doesn't mean just yielding to the market. There are new creativities to be found if you postpone. It's not abolish. It's postponing the formal thing, and this act of postponing, which needs quite another interpretation of the architect's role, is something really that's really going on. And I try to point out that this reluctance to define architecture immediately in terms of form, well, there maybe we have something Dutch. And this is not about weak form, it's l'inform, it's non-form. So it's not another version of form, no, it's simply no form at the starting as a starting point of the design. Of course, in the end result you have form. Of course, the VPRO building in Hilversum has form. Of course, the Erasmus Bridge is a great form. Of course, the Water Expo building of Knox and Cas Oosterhuis is really form. But it is not the starting point, it's the end result. And that reversal of the meaning of form in the design process is quite important, I think.
Someone has a question.
Question. have any more questions, or shall we just ask the three speakers to perhaps respond a little bit to that final point? More questions? I have one question which I've given away, which came from Raymond Ryan, who's an architect critic and lecturer at the University College in Dublin, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And he said, in a state where planning, pragmatism and objectivity, Sachlichkeit, of course, are of such great importance, what is the role of individual expression? Perhaps you would like to answer that, and Caroline.
Well, it's a nice continuation of the previous comment, I guess, isn't it? Yeah. Well, the whole notion of individual expression, of course, is really at stake here. The notion of the individual at large is at stake, and the notion of expressionism, architecture as a matter of to express yourself, is at stake. And this also has to do a lot with this topic of form, because form was the way most of the times architects express themselves. Apparently, I don't agree with the interpretation of the flat landscape as a condition of formlessness, because if you look, for instance, to the brick expressionism tradition in Holland, which is still quite strong, you see especially the opposite, that relying on the very matter that's provided by the soil, you can produce a style which is exuberant. It's extravaganza. So I not think it has anything to do with territory again. It has nothing to do with the soil. It has nothing to do with the bodem. It has to do with the present conditions to which Holland and also other countries, except for maybe the country surrounding the RIBA, is trying to adapt. So that's the whole point. It's the loss of the individual, the hybridization of the individual, and also the hybridization of the architectural, the architect as an individual. So this endless, let's say, this basic avant-garde notion of the lonely genius designing something and come up with a final form is really what's at stake here.
Caroline, would you like to comment on that?
Well, when you say that, I say and yet, because I think it's never that simple, and there is of course an internal drive. There is still sometimes when I see a project that has been produced in our office, I see it for the first time in reality, I'm amazed. There is some sort of sensibility that I see going straight back to Ben, and I don't know how it can get into a project in the circumstances that you work. And that is maybe the last real taboo of architecture, certainly at this moment, that we don't discuss things like that. And maybe that's why I'm extra pleased that I'm here this evening as the example and the instance, and you can dissect me, but I will not contribute to it, or I would be killing myself.
Charles Jencks, do you want to dissect this issue any further, or shall we go and have some wine upstairs?
Probably wine, national Dutch wine, but
it's global wine.
Global wine. I just want to say something that hasn't been said, because although it's been intimated that there is something here which is Dutch, because it's kind of a neo-pragmatism. And neo-commercialism, it's kind of commercial realism, and that because of pressing international contingencies and the way architecture is produced in Holland and now is embraced by big business, is on the one hand it's been attacked in your journal as fresh conservatism, and I know you're very aware of this, and you're also, both of, well, I guess anyone in this situation is skeptical of the way the very real pressures of globalization and nationalism, in the sense that it now has happened with Blair and the Dome, leads to a closing down of what is a larger cultural and architectural discussion. And I'm interested that you end your statement about the last real taboo, because in a sense it is in a Calvinist country, if this is Calvinism, this new Sachlichkeit, this degree zero, this end of the artist, which I think is basically the average production. It's rather like Britain, frankly, in a funny way. For 30 years in this country, it's been very hard for the leading architects to ever talk about what's really on their mind in a public way. They have to hide it behind a kind of Sachlich, functionalist, high-tech utilitarianism. Sterling always said, you never talk aesthetics or preferences of the client. And so, because for the same Adam Smithian reasons, that you wouldn't maybe do that in Holland. And I think that's why obviously there has to be a tension between that common utilitarian culture, which is very strong now, and the way you architects use it and make it perform to your own things, desires. But what I think is lacking is a coming out of the closet, bringing the taboo out, and being responsible for that on a public level. Because what is architecture if it can never name itself? That's then you have architecture produced, as in the Soviet Union, under kind of, behind, between consenting adults and private. You don't get them into the public realm where they can say, this is what we believe in, this is what we stand in, it's worth fighting for. You get it slipped to the client and slipped to the society, and you get an averaging, which is really, I think, desperate for architecture.
Well, on the basis that a good host should never offend a guest, does Ole Bouman want to give the final word, or shall we allow him to give his final words informally upstairs in the bar? You have the choice.
I would like to say that the last two shadings of my proposition is very welcome to me. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to each of the three speakers, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm glad that you've stayed the course. It's been very sultry, and we'll go on being sultry. So thank you very much.